Waiting for the slide to finish. I gotta stop doing that. Okay, there we go. We're on. All right, good. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Autistic Voices Roundtable Discussions. My name is Philip King Lowe. I am the owner, producer, and host of today's Autistic Moment, a podcast for autistic adults by an autistic adult. This episode of Autistic Voices Roundtable Discussions is sponsored by Looking Forward Life Coaching. Looking Forward helps change stumbling blocks into stepping stones towards success. Visit lookingforwardlc.org for more information. Over the past 4 months, some remarks have been made that are undermining the advances that autistic people have made over the years. The remarks include, but are not limited to, vaccines causing autism. Over the past 25 years, since Andrew Wakefield made this assertion in 1998, numerous researchers have concluded that autism is not, quote, caused by the measles vaccine. In fact, the Lancelot published its own reply to that by saying this is the worst medical hoax in the last 100 years. That was in 2010. Other remarks have been, I have never in my life seen a man at my age with full-blown autism, not once. And then there's recent remarks made by the current administration that have said that autism is a, quote, danger to society. Okay. These statements really should not go unanswered by autistic people, since they're obviously not consulting autistic people to make such remarks. Most likely, I highly doubt it. So I am joined today by 3 panelists who are joining me to talk about I am autistic, I am not disordered. With me today is Daren Howard, who is the Deputy Director at the Autism Society of Minnesota. Also from the Autism Society of Minnesota is Jillian Nelson, who is the Public Policy Director and Advocate. And a special guest, Eric Garcia, who is the author of the book, We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. It is a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you for joining me. And I do look forward to this discussion today. We want to be very clear that we are, we're going to answer these things with a few questions here. And so there should be a really great conversation. And please, by all means, when you see it, if you're listening now, welcome. And if you're going to be seeing it later after it's recorded, please share it with other people, because that's how we help other people learn the truth from autistic people. So I'm going to start with these first questions here, and then I'll let our panelists answer. My first 2 questions to our panel today are, when did you discover that you were autistic? And when you concluded for yourself that you were not disordered, what difference did that make for you? Let's start with Eric, then we'll go to Jillian, and then Daren. Go ahead.
Yeah, great question. It was funny. It was a really interesting time. I'm 34 years old, so I was diagnosed around the time that short I was around 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old when my mom took me to go get screened because she saw an ad in the newspaper about, for pre-K screenings for developmental for if I was developing properly. And it was then that there was a test. They thought that initially they thought I was deaf, and then later on they realized, oh, it was like, or they thought that I might have bad hearing. It was just because I wasn't responsive. And then that began the process of to and fro for the next 3 or 4 years because like Asperger's syndrome was not considered a thing, and then it wasn't until we were living in Texas that I really began. So I was around, excuse me, 7 or 8 that we began to look into it. As far as realizing that I wasn't disordered, really it wasn't until my 20s until I started writing about this. So about a decade ago, when I started meeting other autistic people, interviewing other autistic people, and really just coming to understand and learn more about autism more than I previously had. That was really the beginning of that.
Thank you. Jillian, go ahead.
My story is very different from Eric's, probably because I'm a bit older at 42. When I was growing up, we didn't really label individuals that had more autonomy and like more language as autistic. Um, I was 21 years old and I was actually at the time a homeless drug addict. And I have siblings that are a lot younger than me. My brother was about 4 years old and he was really struggling in the preschool setting. And a teacher had suggested that he go get assessed. And my mom took him to the same neuropsych person that had treated me for everything but autism when I was growing up. And sure enough, he diagnosed my brother with autism. Back then it was Asperger's syndrome. And he remembered my mom and he remembered me. And he went and he looked back at some of my test results and then called my mom and was like, "Hey, I think we might have missed something and she should probably go get an assessment as an adult." And sure enough, at 21, I was diagnosed with autism. And it didn't really actually change anything about me. It just kind of all of a sudden explained everything. But it was also the time period where there wasn't a single book out about adults with Asperger's. Everything I was learning about myself came from all these parenting books about children, which really didn't give me that security that there wasn't something wrong with me. Not to mention that the community was still very, very small of autistic adults at that time. It was actually about 7 years before I met another woman with autism. And the first woman I ever met with autism was Temple Grandin. She's not exactly someone that I get to be BFFs with and go to the mall, or call up to have talk about a boyfriend. So that was challenging. And for me, though, when it finally became something I wasn't ashamed of and something that I didn't view as a disorder, and I started to see it as um, an inherent part of my self-worth and who I am, was actually my mom made me do a public policy advocacy program through the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. And I will tell you guys, I absolutely did not want to go. My mom told me I could live at home and go to college for free, or live at home and not pay rent if I signed up for this program. So I did. And I was like, there's no way they're going to pick me. And then they picked me, and I was like, okay, I'll go. I'm going to build this career and I'm going to work with LGBT youth, and I'm sure I'll be able to use some of this information about resources to help them. And I went, and it was the first time I existed in a space where disability wasn't othering me, where there were people that wanted to hear what I said, not in spite of my disability or not because I hid my disability, but because of my lived experience with my disability. And then in that same space, I was given opportunities that really made me realize that some of the things that I like the most about myself and some of the things that I'm most proud about myself aren't in spite of my autism, but they're truly because of my autism. And that was kind of like my first aha moment in autism is a superpower, which I don't necessarily think it's a superpower anymore, but that was a unique stepping stone for me realizing that it's not a disorder. It's just an entirely alternative way of existing in this world. And then as I started to really kind of begin to understand a lot more about intersectionality and as a queer person, really recognizing that being queer didn't like I knew from the moment I came out that being queer didn't make me less. There wasn't something wrong with me because of who I loved. That really kind of paved the way for me to understand that my brain functioning differently and not being the expected norm of how I should behave socially or interact or think about things. That also wasn't a disorder. It was just something else that makes me Jillian. And it's something else that gives me talents and gives me things that I'm good at and also brings about some challenges that I have to deal with on a daily basis. And then finding community. The first time I ever volunteered at the Autism Society, and I was in a room full of autistic adults just like myself, like that was the crowning moment where it really was no longer a disorder. Like I realized in that moment that I am not profoundly special as an autistic person. I am a completely average autistic person. That I am 100% exactly as the rest of my community when I'm in space with my community. But until there was that community, like so it was very much a step-by-step process to figure out that I'm not disordered and that I just am and I am who I am and this is the way I exist. And when I'm in the space of people like me, that's where it all makes sense.
I agree. And I before Daren comes on, you were the first person I spoke to when I came to Austin. You remember that?
I do, back when I was still at the front desk rather than Capitol Hill.
Yep,
So
I do. Yep. And boy, you and Awesome, you really made a huge difference in where I am. This is why I'm here where I am now. So I'll talk a little bit more about that after Daren. Go ahead, Daren.
Sure. So, well, first of all, Philip, thanks for having all of us here to talk about this stuff. There's been a lot more autism discourse in the zeitgeist recently. Not all of it is accurate, and so it's I feel really privileged to be able to address some of it. I also feel privileged to be able to share a little bit about my personal story. So, we'll share our ages, so I'll share my age too. I'm 38, and what that means is that I'm a child of the 80s, and I missed diagnosis as a kid. Um, I have had a few different careers, but for a long time worked in education, and I became a parent, and my kid started to struggle in school, like the second that he went to school. Um, Struggled in preschool, and then really struggled in kindergarten. Um, and I looked at those struggles and was pretty frustrated. I had education experience and lots of experience being around kids in community and felt like nobody's really prepared to be a parent fully, but like I felt as prepared as I could be to be a parent and then was hit with all these real challenges that my kid was facing. And so at some point, we identify that autism is what's at play in my kid's experience and what is contributing to his challenges. But leading up to that moment, I had really discounted the possibility. I overlooked some of these challenges as, being things that were difficult for our family, but were things that everybody faced. I normalized so much of his behavior that as relatable as something that I also experienced, that I presumed everyone else experienced. And I normalized it so much that even though I had been exposed to the concept of autism and I had experience with education, I did not see it in my own kid. And so when he got a diagnosis, it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me because I realized that the main reason I wasn't seeing it was because I'm also autistic and that I related to his experiences because they're a lot like my experiences. And I'll admit that our support needs are different. Our sort of profile around the autism spectrum is different, but we both have autism. And we both experience differences in our communication and in our socialization. We both have repetitive behaviors and really love routine and things like that. And from there, we start to diverge a little bit. We're two distinct people. And I think that that's true of the whole autism community. But for folks who might be listening or watching today, those things I just mentioned, that's the diagnostic criteria. And that criteria has changed over time. Um, and as we refined that diagnostic criteria, more and more people started to get a diagnosis. And so I'm kind of in that camp, that late stage adult diagnosis camp. I had that experience specifically because my kid got diagnosed, which brings me to the hereditary nature of the condition, that there's a genetic component, um, and that it runs in the family, which I think Jillian alluded to as well. And so when I got a diagnosis, I doubted a lot and I needed to verify it and prove it to myself. And so I got a formal, psychological evaluation, not just an initial diagnosis from my therapist. Um, and then I went out and got a second opinion because I'm very privileged to have had great healthcare at the time. Um, and there's just no getting away from it. I'm autistic. And there was a few different feelings that I experienced there. Mostly the feeling was relief because I understood myself better and I understood my kid better and I could do something about the challenges that we were facing. Um, there's also some grief. I called my mother after all this happened and I shared the experience with her, and she said, "Oh, yeah, they said you might have Asperger's when you were 5, but I didn't do anything about it because I didn't want you to have a label." And, you know, I understand that it was the 80s and that there wasn't a ton of resources. There was a lot more stigma than there is today. And that if I had that sort of Asperger's profile, and for folks who don't know the difference, Asperger's is autism. But at the time, it was a distinct diagnostic, it was a distinct diagnosis. And it was characterized by differences, by things like stronger communication skills, intelligence, stuff like that. And what we understand now is that that's not really distinct conditions, it's just different experiences of the same condition. So, the diagnostic criteria has changed, and the moment at time that I was a kid and could have gotten a diagnosis, I kind of skirted by. But what that meant was that I didn't have access to special education services. And, I am an intelligent guy, but I struggled a lot. And if I didn't struggle academically, I certainly struggled in terms of communication and relationships and managing my emotions, right? And so the idea that I could have had support the whole time was really frustrating. And I had some anger. But I actually, one of the very first books that I read post-diagnosis about autism was Eric's book. Eric's book, We're Not Broken, was, gosh, life-changing for me because that was the exact message I needed in that moment. That I'm different, that there's something happening here, but that there's a historical context to it, that I'm not broken or damaged. I do identify as having a disability. And I know that not everybody who's autistic necessarily embraces that label. I do, because I'm not ashamed of having a disability. The other thing that got me there from, you know, not being ashamed of having a disability was Dr. Devin Price's book, Unmasking Autism. Those two things, and then you throw in some like additional historical stuff, like Steve Silberman's Neurotribes, and I start like building this informed narrative about who I am and what this community means. Um, and I went from a lot of personal pain and anguish and frustration uh, to realizing that I'm like part of a community and part of a movement. And that has been really empowering.
I just want to like piggyback. First off, Daren, can't thank you enough for that. But Jillian, I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to piggyback off of what Jillian said, which is to say that you're not extraordinary. And I don't mean I am prone to agree because all three of us, I mean, look, I think we're all great, but like all four of us, but we're not extraordinary. We just had more resources and tools. And I think one of the things that I learned when I was writing about autism, when I was starting to learn about writing about, when I was starting to report, and seriously, interview autistic people was how many exceptional autistic people didn't have the same opportunities that I had. And so what I really want for autistic people in society is so that Jillian, Daren, myself, and Phil aren't considered extraordinary, that we're just normal, and that we can achieve the same stuff that anybody else can. Because what is extraordinary? Extraordinary is a deviation from the norm. It is extraordinary. And we shouldn't be extraordinary. We should be we should be the norm. We should, every autistic person should have the same opportunities that we do so that we can rise and fall on our own merits. I think that's really important. I think that's what I wanted to say and kind of piggyback on what Jillian said.
Yeah, that's fine. The only
Can I
thing
just add to that real quick? You're exactly right, Eric. Like I interface with a lot of our community through my job, and I hear all the time, like from parents, like, "Oh, I hope my kid can grow up to be like you," or I hear from autistic adults, like, "Oh, how can I do all the things that you do?" The reality is that there's nothing exceptional about me. Well, maybe a couple things, but what the reason I'm here, the reason I have the opportunities I am, the reason that I am the leader I am, it's not because I am a special, unique person that was magically gifted. It's that I happened to get lucky enough to work in a place that sees me and understands me and supports me. That if we are people like us are the proof that if we have the right supports and we have the right services, that autism doesn't have to hold people back from doing things. And that it really is our society that is the most disabling thing for so many of us. And that is that the disorder isn't being autistic. The disorder is living in an inaccessible world.
Yeah, absolutely.
To respond, and then we'll move on to the next question here because that one's going to take a little longer to answer. I do agree with both of you. I'm also reminded of the first episode that I recorded with Ellie Wilson, who said that there is, maybe still is, a therapist at the Autism Society of Minnesota who is fond of saying that normal is a setting on a washing machine, and it's not really useful when talking about people. So I'm reminded of something like that. And before we jump into my, forgetting it, Ruby. Before we jump into my third question, um, you know, many of my audience has heard my own story of being identified and then my journey. And I will say, I'll just repeat this again. I was originally diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a term I no longer accept. And also just the first 5 years after I was diagnosed was a real difficult time for me because I was grieving losses. But I also just went through this period now making sense of things that were, and I felt like a total social invalid. I just felt like I couldn't get along, I couldn't draw close to anybody. And then in December of 2017, I called a number and got Jillian Nelson working at the desk, who and I started getting introduced to the Autism Society of Minnesota. I went to quite a few of the support groups that they have for LGBT people who are autistic. And I attended some of the other meetings, and then I attended the classes, and then came my first Minnesota Autism Conference that in April 2018, which totally opened my eyes to, wow, there's a group of people who are like me. And then following September, I went through this certification classes with them, and believe me, their work is extraordinary. And that started changing me from thinking I was an invalid to I just need to be around my people. Basically, I need my own community. And let me just say something. Ever since I've started today's autistic moment and doing these autistic voices roundtable discussions, I have discovered the most remarkable group of people who are autistic. I found authors like Eric, like Scott Forstard, my good friend. I've discovered special people who work on, like with autistic burnout for women, like Carol Jean Whittington. I have found people who can talk self-care, like Becca Laurie Hector. I have found all of these incredible people who are more than willing to come forth and tell their stories. Why? Because I made a safe space for them to do so. So anyway, so yes, that's one of those things that I count as a true blessing for my life anyway. But now we're going to get into the third question, and this one really is important. Um, how can autistic advocates like us, with the misinformation that's coming out, like about vaccines causing autism and the most recent set that are just deplorable. And let me say that my concern with these things, excuse me again, is not so much of what's being said, but what's being believed.
Yeah.
Because the problem is it creates a society of people who literally take this stuff to heart, and before we know it, we have more biases added on to the ones we already have. And my biggest concern is hate violence and stuff that just it's so horrible. And so once those things come out, it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. That's what my concern is. So but how can autistic advocates, how can we answer stuff like this? Go ahead, Jillian, you go first.
I mean, as a public policy director, I will shameless plug, stay involved politically.
Yeah.
Our stories are incredibly valuable. We have the ability to be the walking, talking, or not talking in some cases, but the proof that there's these mistruths about what autistic people are. By just existing and telling our stories and living our lives, we can very much disprove those myths. I think it's really important that we as a community continue supporting each other in that as well. I think that there's a lot of people that one of my biggest fears in this time of all of these mistruths and all of the things that are being spread about our community is I worry most about the people that are just joining our community, and that these are the messages they're getting about who they are as they're finding their own identities.
I agree.
So, like really rallying around each other and dispelling those myths, talking about what's possible, continuing to get vaccinated because it is in fact not going to make us more autistic. So I mean, really just I think the biggest form of resistance we have right now against these mistruths is really living our lives with joy and authenticity, giving back to our community, and while doing that, being open and proud of who we are. Um, there are so many ideas. I mean, if someone would have told my mom when my brother was first diagnosed and her perspective of autism was only my brother and my cousin, who had a very classical presentation of autism, that someday all of her kids would be diagnosed autistic. She would identify as autistic, and one of her children would be a policy director for a well-reputed autism organization. She probably would have laughed and been convinced that that would be absolutely impossible. In fact, for a long time, she didn't support my own diagnosis because of the level of success I was able to achieve. But by continuing to be autistic, by not sugarcoating the hard times and only presenting a poster child type image, I've really been able to kind of dispel some of those myths within my own community and my own family and really change that perspective. And I think as a community, we really have to do that on a more global level. Like, I'm not saying we need to like televise all of our worst moments and our meltdowns, but we do have to be willing to humble ourselves and say, yeah, this is what I'm capable of with the right support, with the right services. When you don't cut Medicaid spending, this is who I can be. And also talk about those hard days and why all of those services and supports are necessary. And really humanize our community and stop allowing the current political climate to paint a caricature of what autism is in our society and really show up in 3D and full Kodachrome Technicolor and show the world what we really, really are, because we are the best evidence that those truths aren't real.
Yeah, very well said, Jillian. Daren, go ahead.
Thanks, Philip. I think that lies about vulnerable, marginalized minority groups pick up steam because of people's worldviews, not because of whether or not the lie itself has any sort of air of legitimacy. It feels really easy to refute some of the lies that are being perpetuated right now. And I think that, I want to do that, but I also want to just say that, like, when you come at people who believe misinformation with more information, they've already been primed not to believe us. And I think probably our solutions need to be a mix of relationship building, which gets a which only it's only in relationships that we can move people away from misinformation. And then it sounds weird, but I would pair that relationship building with an all-out fight. Like, we have to fight for our human rights. As people with disabilities, we can be paid less than minimum wage, right? As people with disabilities, we do not have marriage equality because of the way that our social services are structured. Those are things I'm going to fight for. And I sometimes get people telling me that I don't seem autistic because of the way that I communicate, or that they think I must be high functioning. And let me be clear that I reject functioning labels. They're harmful. They're tools of oppression. But however you perceive my functioning, I'm going to take whatever skills and assets and resources I have to this fight. And I think that we need to at this point. And so maybe as a resource to listeners and viewers today, I would just like to address a couple of specific myths. And again, we don't change people's minds by correcting them. We change people's minds in relationship. And we get our rights by fighting for them. But information is still power. So there is a lie that vaccines cause autism. This is completely false. It comes from a fraudulent study in the late 90s, published by a guy named Andrew Wakefield. He lost his medical license for publishing a fraudulent study, and it has been refuted hundreds of times. And I will say, we had to spend money every single time we refuted that study, right? We had to fund that research, and that's money that didn't go to autistic people. It's money that was wasted arguing about an obvious lie. And there are real harms being caused by this vaccine lie. I was a little devastated today to see a headline that said that the most recent measles outbreak in Texas has now taken the life of a child who was unvaccinated. You can't die from autism. You can die from measles.
Yep.
Now, autistic people have shorter lifespans, statistically, but that has to do with the other social determinants of health. And this lie about vaccines is not supported by any data, but it causes real harm.
Exactly.
The other lie that I'm hearing is that there's an autism epidemic. And there's a couple of cherry-picked stats that are used, that in the mid-century it was 1 in 10,000 or so, and in recent data it's 1 in 36 nationally in the United States. And so if you plot that, the chart looks like a hockey stick, right? And I get the feeling that that might look like an epidemic. And when folks are fighting for resources, fear-based arguments carry some power. So I even understand the parents who were saying that it was an epidemic when it is absolutely not. But the data does not support the idea that there is an epidemic. First of all, when we talk about that really low incidence rate, those are not prevalence studies. It's generous to call them studies. I mean, one of the first one was this study in a specific area in London of kids, I think in a 3-year age range. And there's this point when they do all this work to collect up all this data, and there's sort of a diagnostic ambiguity at the time about what autism is, because not a lot of people actually get the diagnosis. And so they're a little nervous about uh, making an assertion about the data. So they just arbitrarily cut the data set in half and they say the top half has autism, the bottom half doesn't. And there's just like no logic for this. And so that gets you your 1 to 4 in 10,000, a study that is groundbreaking for its time, but not reflective of data. We have only studied prevalence since about the year 1999, 2000. We have a pretty good study of prevalence that the CDC will reference, and that's where that 1 in 36 number comes from. And at the beginning of that study, the number was more like 1 in 60 something or 1 in 150. So autism prevalence is on the rise according to the data. But those autistic people have been there the whole time. There is no evidence to suggest that the number of people with autism has increased. What has increased is the number of people accessing the diagnosis. And that comes from the diagnostic criteria getting refined, which it has done several times. We've mentioned the term Asperger's today. The history of the person that that term is named for is interesting. But to keep us on topic, we dropped the term for scientific reasons before we found out about that history. And so as we refine the diagnostic criteria, different people get a diagnosis. When you look at that CDC study, you'll see a sort of a prevalence shape in the chart. And then if you look at it by race, you see the exact same shape at just a lower prevalence rate for most of the study, right? So in other words, autism prevalence is not affected by things like race, but it was just a lower prevalence. And come on, it doesn't take a genius to point out that non-white folks have less access to American healthcare, right?
Right. Yeah.
So in summation, there's no correlation to vaccines. That's a temporal correlation. Autism shows up in the first few years of life at the same time that we're giving kids a bunch of vaccines. There's no evidence of an epidemic. These cherry-picked data points are being used to manipulate people.
Agreed.
But there is an epidemic of need. Living with a disability is about survival. And I think sometimes neurological disabilities aren't as visible for everybody. And so it's hard to see that we are struggling to survive, but we are. As I mentioned, we have a lower lifespan statistically.
Yeah.
And so I would love it if we could spend less time arguing about this stuff and less money on pointless research
Yeah.
and a lot more time figuring out how to support people with disabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of episodes about Black autistic adults who do say that they have less access, a disparity of access to being identified, and also just how the criteria is measured. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of I want to give an amen and a hallelujah to both what Jillian and
Yes, absolutely.
Daren said. I think that Daren pointed out something that I really want to say, which is that, like I cover politics, I cover federal policy. Those research dollars, guess where those federal research dollars come from? They come from the NIH. and the NIH has a limited, finite budget. And think about how much more research we could have spent on adult transition services and education and lifespan issues. We were talking about lifespan issues early. Think about how much money we were talking about efficiency in government these days. Think about how much more money we could have saved, or how much more money could have been well spent, and we
Exactly.
could have gotten a better return on our investment. But to the point, Daren, you said something that I really want to emphasize, which is that you can't change people's minds. I think that, like, those of us who work in expertise areas, because we came to this through learning, we think, oh, if everybody had the same information we had, then they would make the same rational decision. Look, but I cover politics, and I know that's not the case. The exact opposite happens. What happens is people receive information and they shoehorn it into their pre-existing ideologies. And it reminds me. Look, my dad's from Texas, and he used to quote this line from my grandfather, who passed away before I was born, all the time, which is, "Don't confuse me with the facts. I've already made up my mind." Uh, and I think that's important because, to your point, Daren, and to your point, Jillian, with stories. Look, I'm a journalist. I'm a storyteller. That's my trade. I'm not an advocate. I'm a journalist. I try to use story to portray the humanity of people. Uh, I think there's something very powerful with telling stories. There's something. It's not a look, we know the point, the plural of anecdote is not evidence, but there's something very powerful about stories and about examples, that it humanizes the data. And I think that the other thing is, like, to your point about Darren, about relationships, I'll give you an example. It's funny how many people support, this last year I was at the RNC, I was at the Republican National Convention. And it's funny because, just this last weekend, I was with the president, and he repeated the same stuff he always says about vaccines and autism. And he talked about the point that Daren made, which is about, we had 136 babies with autism. Something's wrong, and Robert F. Kennedy's going to do it and, fix something about it. But when I was at the RNC, there were people who read my book, and I met them. And there are people, you'd be surprised how many people come to ideas about vaccines and autism because they feel like they are being failed from by the system. We have to understand why people get into conspiracy theories. It is not a coincidence that many of the most prominent anti-vaccine activists are women, because guess who does most of the caregiving? It's moms. It is not a coincidence that it is mostly parents of high support needs kids, because they often feel like the system is failing them, that they have to go through. Jillian, I don't have to tell you about the reams of paperwork that you have to fill out to get a 504 meeting, an IEP,
Medicaid.
Medicaid, getting on the, Minnesota's better than others on the Medicaid wait list, but, like, it's still a wait list. Conspiracy theories offer a rationale. It offers someone to blame. It's like, it's not your fault that this is going on. There are these forces larger than you that are colluding and conspiring against you. And I think that that's where storytelling and relationships are important, because what it does is it says there's not this grand scheme that is colluding against you. Often it's just bureaucracy that is just piled on, and it's been a bunch of bad ideas, or bad ideas with good intentions, that kind of just piled up. And I think just having people who support them and listening to what people are going through and validating it. The worst thing we can do is say, no, 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 no. Yeah, we should say, yeah, there's not an epidemic. But we shouldn't say, no, 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 you're not, you're wrong. We have to understand, we have to listen, we have to hear and receive and say, I hear you, I understand you. And this is where things are wrong. And this is where we can probably work together. I think that's more powerful. We can't condescend. I think that's what I would say. And so I just want to give an amen and a hallelujah to both Jillian and Daren.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think that's really well framed. And I want to draw a connection here because I'm sensitive to some of the privilege that I do carry around vaccines. Black folks in this country have had a completely different experience with vaccination than white folks. And they've been experimented on. Their consent has been violated. Uh, it's a whole longer conversation to provide detail there, but there's no doubt that it's fair for the Black community in this country to have some vaccine hesitancy. And I think it's fair for people who care about health to wonder what is in a pharmaceutical, right? Like we have to validate people's concerns when we meet them where they're at, but we also have to be crystal clear about the science
Yes.
and unwavering about the science.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
is different from the relationship part of it.
yeah. I want to direct my listening audience to a show of Autistic Voices Roundtable discussions I did, I think, a couple summers ago about the dangers of medical myths, where I talked with three individuals, one of whom is Nicola Whiting from the United Kingdom, regarding the vaccine matter. One of those panelists made, you know what it sounds like you're saying? You'd rather have a dead child than an autistic child. That's one of the messages he's getting.
Yeah.
The other one is that if you really want a really great example of how bad studies of autistic people are, you should hear what Nicola Whiting had to say. Because, and I'm just going to repeat it, you can go back and hear her say it herself. They had a study in the United Kingdom, and apparently it was about the morality of autistic people. And the study was basically they took about 25 individuals who were not autistic between the ages of 14 and 25. And then they had a group of autistic people between the ages of 14 and 25. And the study was based on giving somebody an enormous amount of money to carry out a task that is, quite frankly, gross. And the task that they asked them to do was to, if you were given a certain amount of money, would you go out and kill all the kittens and cats and basically reduce the strays? And the thing is that the majority of the non-autistic says, yeah, give me the money, I'll go do it. The majority of autistics said, no way, not even for a large amount of money would I ever go do that. And so the result of that, the conclusion they came to, was that, quote, the autistic people were broken because they lacked self-interest. And I was like, wait a minute, that is because they're certainly not going to put into a report that autistic people have a greater
I would have ended up with 30 cats in my house and the money and pretended I had done it.
Yes.
I would have been in a lot of trouble with my partner.
It's but the point is they're not going to credit autistic people with having a greater morality. They couldn't possibly do that because then that, and that's one of the things that goes wrong with these programs, with these studies. They wind up getting altered in some way, shape, or form to suggest that we're the problem, not them. And it really talk about the unfair advantage here. But yeah, definitely. So I want to encourage my audience to go back to that show, because the problem with that whole those theories about things like vaccines cause autism, or even the worst one in more recent days, that women who take acetaminophen risk giving birth to children with ADHD or autism, which is even worse, in my opinion. But anyway, the point is everything that comes from those myths is fruit of the poisonous tree. That's what the problem is. Now, before I give my closing remarks, because we're getting here up to about 9 minutes before the hour here, the focus of today's autistic moment in this year is navigating the future of multidimensional autistic leadership, because I want us autistics to feel like we have the power to navigate through these times as leaders, not as recipients of bad language or bad results. Okay, we actually have a leadership role to play. That, of course, really starts with how we take care of ourselves. That's why I say on numerous occasions, if you're overwhelmed, turn off the social media, turn it off, turn your notifications off, just let it go for a while. It's okay if you do that. But I've got some great shows coming up. One is going to be Carol Jean Whittington is going to join me on March 9th to talk about what is autistic leadership. Carol Jean Whittington brings her enthusiasm and such great energy to a topic like this. And then Becca Laurie Hector, I call Becca my self-care specialist, is going to talk about self-care as personal autistic leadership. And coming up in April, forgive me again, I have two great shows that are going to highlight two of the great programs that we have here in Minnesota. The first show in April is going to be educating future autistic leaders, and that is going to be with two folks from Minnesota Independence College and Community. Andrea Pollitt, whom I worked personally with, is going to have a graduate, Jenna Olson, going to talk about how they work together to educate autistics to be future leaders. And then the other one that's coming on will be Emily and Ann Voigt from the Autism Mentorship Program to talk about mentoring future autistic leaders. These are two of our fantastic programs here in Minnesota. Believe me, they're doing incredible work. So there's lots of great stuff coming up. And last but not least, I'll say, Carol Jean Whittington and we're going to be teaming up together to co-host the Summer of Self-Care series this year. I'm going to do some co-hosting with her. She's going to do some co-hosting with me. It's hard for me to add to a lot of the great stuff that's been said here. Our panelists today, Daren, Jillian, and of course Eric, they've given so much important things to be said, and I almost feel like for me to say anything more would be overkill. But they've heard me say this beforehand, but I had a spiritual director once who was fond of saying, the only reason nonsense becomes popular than actual facts is because nonsense is more easily accepted and promoted. And that's one of the things that we're hearing with all of these things. It's not based on any real information other than somebody did a study or something that they got. And quite frankly, even studies, I'm quite reluctant, because whomever probably did the study has their own reasons for doing it to make their own conclusions. That's just my point. So yeah, that's some of my problems with a lot of this. And I'm going to conclude with something that I've said on numerous occasions that my guests have really said quite really. The best way to learn about autistic people is to listen to autistic people, not some set of studies by professionals. It's to actually listen to us. So this is why I always say, is that each autistic person has to become the expert at your own brand, make, and model of autism. Thank you, Jillian, by the way, for those words. You have to become your own expert. You really do. And you have to become your own expert about communicating. And I always talk, because my panelists here have already said it, You must tell your stories to others about what being autistic means for you. You know, if you don't become an advocate for yourself, it's hard to ask anybody else to help advocate with you. So you have to do some of your own, however you do it, whether it's through podcasting, authoring books, or artwork, or something that you do. You need to become that. And there's a lot of great organizations out there, like the Autism Society of Minnesota, and many others that are definitely going to help you do that. So I want to thank my audience for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, and thank you so much to Daren, Jillian, and Eric for this. This has been a fantastic conversation. And if you have any questions about today's autistic moment, please write me at today'sautisticmoment@gmail.com. And thank you very much for joining us today, and may you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, I gotta head out.
Wait, whoa, whoa. Not yet. Wait. Let me get off.